All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of Sabbath School Boot Camp. We are covering week 4 of the second quarter of 2022. The Adult Bible Study Guide is on the book of Genesis, and we are talking about Noah and the flood today. And I'm joined once again by Jim Maros, who's an elder in the state of Michigan. And we're happy that he's joining us because he brings some awesome insights in here. He's a MDiv, graduated from the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary just like me. So obviously, between the two of us, we know everything, right?
Well, I went to the Creation Museum and the Ark Experience, so I really know everything now.
Yeah, I mean, why am I even here? Someone's got to hit record and upload it to YouTube, I guess. I'm just going to sit back. Well, anyways, as always, guys, our goal in Sabbath School Boot Camp is to focus on presenting the lesson, the material, primarily for Sabbath School teachers and those front row students who just want to get more out of this because, I think Jim and I probably share this conviction that we want Sabbath School discussions to be fruitful, to be engaging, to be places of growth for churches. And too often, I know I've gone to Sabbath schools where it's just everyone just kind of repeats the standard talking points and beliefs, and I don't perceive a lot of growth sometimes. We just kind of say the canned answers that we're used to saying. And so we really want to dive deep into these lessons, and hopefully it's not that we want you teachers to take everything we say and teach it. It's really we just want to get you thinking, maybe give you a point here or there that you can use to have a better discussion in your Sabbath School class. So that's a long way of telling you what Sabbath School Boot Camp is all about. We're happy that you are here. Now, I want to begin just by saying, with a little caveat here about this lesson, because there's a lot here that is difficult to understand. Who are the Nephilim? Who are the sons of God that saw that the daughters of man were fair, and all of this sort of stuff. Why did God destroy the world in the flood? I mean, is that just? It's men, women, it's children, it's animals, it's plant life. I mean, all of this stuff. Like, why would God do that? And all of this is present in the first 8 verses of the chapter. Now, we're talking about the flood, which spans several chapters. And the caveat, the caution is that as a teacher, you can get caught up in those first 8 verses and just never get anywhere. You can just spin your wheels. Who are the Nephilim? Well, I think it's this. Well, I think it's that. Well, I think it's that. You can talk about the justice of the flood all day long. And you can look up, and it is time to close Sabbath School, and you realize, boy, we didn't really get to what we wanted to talk about. So, again, one of the things that we want to tell you guys is if you're teaching, is to have a clear bullet point that you want the class to learn during this session. And if you cover nothing else, it's like, I want you guys to understand this one thing. Now, that may differ from teacher to teacher. You can figure out what that one thing is as the Lord impresses you. But just stick to it. I don't want you to paper over the justice issue. I don't want you to paper over the Nephilim and all that. I'm not saying avoid it. What I'm saying is just you might have to keep the pace going in your class, depending on what kind of people you have in your class. And so that's just something to be aware of. Don't paper over it. Don't hide from it. Talk about these things. But be prepared to accomplish whatever that goal that is, whatever that main lesson is that you want your people to learn by the end of the class. All right, so keep an eye on the clock. Keep an eye on the microphone as it passes around the room. And we want you guys to have a really fruitful discussion. Just something to keep an eye on. Okay, Jim, start us off here. What are we looking at in this lesson this week?
Well, I'm going to build right now on what you just got done saying. People can come to these lessons, and it's like, how many times have we discussed, let's say, Genesis and the flood and the week of creation? But there's 2 more important things than just reading the stories. One is that these apply to us. Mm-hmm. And that goes to the very memory text that we have this week of Jesus Christ himself pointing out to the disciples when they ask about what's the end going to be like? When is it going to be? And he says, just like the days of Noah, so is the coming of the Son of Man in the final days. So that should be enough of a wake-up call right there that we need to be trying to pull and extrapolate from these texts as much spiritual insight for our own lives as possible. And then I'll give you an example. I turned on the cable religious programs this very morning.
Is it Fox News?
And
again?
there was it was not Fox News. You have to stop that.
All right.
I am fair and balanced. I listen a little bit to everybody. Okay. I listen to you, Matthew. I've got to be fair and balanced. Okay?
I know. Well, I just bring that up in case people don't remember from last week. It was I think it was last week, or maybe we talked in between about how they were talking about aliens and stuff on Fox. So it's not a political thing. It's just a topical thing.
Yes. And this morning, I mean, this is Sunday morning. I turn on one of the Sunday morning religious broadcasts, and they're actually speaking on the very same topic that was just on the news the other day. And that is about these sons of God and about angels and humans. And they went off. So not only are these stories, not only is this information in the text important to us spiritually and in the time in which we live, but it goes further. It goes to the fact that we should be sharing with others. I mean, how many Christians have an erroneous understanding of creation and evolution, or things like supernatural beings having sex with humans and what that meant back in the day? And so, I mean, God has provided us. I mean, I look at this as an opportunity. I look at this as responsibility to take the word of God and what I have learned and what I know and what I have studied and share it with others so that error will be dispelled by truth. And you know what? We've been talking about that ever since a snake spoke to Adam and Eve, or Eve.
Yes.
Okay. Now, you did bring up something last week. You kind of briefly mentioned about chiasms, and just for anybody who hasn't been following along here, when we talk about chiasms, we're talking about Hebrew poetry for the most part, where instead of a modern day book or a modern day movie where you look to the very end for the climax, well, we tend to find the center focal point, at the center of the writing. So at the middle of the book of Daniel, the crux is judgment. At the center of the book of Revelation is worship. But there's one more thing I'd like to point out, because, again, this week, just like the previous weeks, we find that there are chiasms, poetic structures in these chapters. And one of the things that I did appreciate Dr. Dukan bringing out in his commentary is that the chiasm also serves to show that the writing is the product of one hand, that this is not just a bunch of multiple authors who have brought this information to us, but that we indeed can trust the author and trust it as an inspired author who is bringing this information to us.
All right. So I'm looking at this chiasm here. This is a long chiasm. And again, I don't want to take for granted that people fully understand these things. We've been talking about them a lot in this quarter. We've been bringing them up, showing them here on screen, and they're usually kind of smaller ones. This one is huge, and I just want to explain people real quick here how these things work, just in case they forgot. But you see, you have A at the top, and then you have A at the bottom, and B at the top, and then B at the bottom, and so forth. Right? What we're basically saying is, it begins in chapter 6, verse 10. The first part they're talking about Noah. It ends talking, in looks like chapter 9, verse 19, talking about Noah. It mentions Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Next, after Noah, look, at the very bottom there, right before it mentions Noah, it mentions Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So it's kind of like they're mirroring each other. It's like a mirror where A reflects A, and B reflects B, and C reflects C, right? And then, of course, you get to that middle where P is, and it says, God remembers Noah. And what you're saying to us is, in a chiasm, that middle statement or fact or name or whatever is considered the focus, the important part. Now, we as in the West, right, we write a story, it begins with a beginning and it ends with an ending, and the end is usually considered the most important part. It's the big reveal, it's the lesson learned, Aesop's fables, and that's why you shouldn't play with fire, right? Like the lesson's at the end. But in chiasm, it's in the middle. It's kind of like a mountain that's on its side, if you can see it there. It's the peak of that mountain that is considered most important.
And we don't want to take away from the fact that each of these writings, especially when I start mentioning books like Daniel and Joel and Revelation, that they still progress to an end. I mean, Revelation ends with the new earth.
Sure.
Daniel ends with the resurrection. Joel ends with all the blessings that came from repentance. And so what we find is that the crux of it is at the center. And when you think about those three books, judgment, worship, repentance, you can see how that middle point is so important, in that if we allow that middle point to hit us personally and affect us personally and to change us personally, then the end of that book, the end of that writing, is something that we can have assurance in.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Just because there's a chiasm being used doesn't mean it's the only lens through which we should understand the text, right? There's other structures at work here as well. And the end is important in many of their writings, just as it is in ours. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and here's a couple thoughts. Take a hymnal, for example, or take a hymn out of a hymnal. Which of the verses is really more important? There are some songs I can't wait to get to the third or fourth stanza, and then that's going to be the one that I really enjoy singing. I really enjoy the words. So the whole thing is important. Okay. It's just maybe I shouldn't use the hymn, since most of us only know the first stanza, right?
No, Amazing Grace is a great example, right? When we've been here with 10,000 years or something, it's like, oh man, when you get to that point, like you're there, man. You've arrived.
Exactly. And one more thing on this chiasm: the larger the chiasm is, the more impressive, the more certain that the author really had that mirroring effect, in his mind.
Yeah.
And hey, can I throw in Revelation here?
Might as well. Let's do it.
All right. Well, because some of our listeners, they're going to perhaps either be aware of the chiasm in Revelation, or they're going to come across that. But what generally happens, and you see it here, where you have the same thing in the front and the same thing in the back, that mirror. Yeah. So when you come to Revelation, you find the same thing. The things in the front basically are the same things in the back. So, Matthew, since I love the four horsemen and the study of them, when I come to Revelation 19 and I see the rider on the white horse is Jesus Christ, well, because of the chiasm, the evidence is greater that the rider on the white horse in the beginning of Revelation is Christ rather than the Antichrist. So a chiasm can be so helpful to us.
Yes. Yeah, it helps connect things. And honestly, if you're just reading through the text, I mean, we're talking about a chiasm that spans 3 chapters here. If you're just reading through this, chances are you're not going to notice this, because you're not noticing how chapter 6 begins versus how chapter 9 ends. Sometimes you just got to take a wide view of things and realize the structure that's being formed here. And you're right. It can help us understand what the author is really wanting us to walk away with. And the fact that God remembers Noah is the central piece here, right? It's about God. He's the subject. Remembers is the verb. Noah is the object. So the subject of this is God and what God does. We call it Noah's flood. It's really God's flood, right? Noah just lived through it. And we don't want to take anything away from Noah. But the story is about God. From beginning to end, the story is about God and the problems God faces. And that's going to lead us over to Sunday's lesson, isn't it?
You want to get off this chiasm, don't you?
Yes, let's do it. All right, hold on here. Let's get rid of this chiasm. There we go. So we're in Genesis 6 here. This is tough, right? We have it up in the NAV on the left, and we have it up in the King James on the right for now. We can move that around as need be. But we'll start with the NAV here. It says, when human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. These first 2 verses, Genesis takes a really weird shift here. Because up until this point, this was a story of individuals, and then it was a story, of a married couple, then it was a story of brothers, And yes, then we have these descendants, but it's usually like one person in each generation that it's really focusing on. And suddenly the earth is full. I don't mean full, like literally populated in every square foot. I just mean suddenly there's a lot of people. It's like you hit fast forward there at the end of chapter 4 and through chapter 5, and suddenly it's a kind of a completely different situation. We're not talking about one human being who made a wrong choice and sinned. We're talking about a ton of them, it seems, who are doing wrong to such an extent where God has to look hard to find somebody who's faithful. And you think, wow, what happened? We went from one person to almost all people in just a drop of a hat here. And it's also puzzling in terms of what it means. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. That's the NIV. You have the King James there. It says the sons of God saw daughters of men that they were fair. Again, just an old way of saying nice to look at. And they took them wives of all which they chose. Not quite a modern way of phrasing that, but the meaning is still the same. NIV, King James, they're both pretty much saying the same thing here. Slightly different words. Jim, what are we talking about? Who are these sons of God, and who are these daughters of men who are getting married with each other, and why is this such a bad thing?
All right. I think we need to kind of get some traction here before we actually get to chapter 6, and that is we need to kind of be thinking about where we left off last time. And when we studied last time, we were looking at Cain and Abel. And we were looking at one man who is righteous, another man who is wicked. And what we know from ongoing reading is that the descendants of Cain, they had some real issues. Okay, we've got polygamy, we've got sexual abuse, sexual depravity, and such. We didn't emphasize a lot on Seth, but Seth came in as a replacement to Abel. Seth was the appointed one to Eve, and now we have the Messianic line that's going to come out of Seth, not out of Cain. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that Dukan points out back there as we leave chapter 4 was that with Seth coming in the picture, God also comes back into the picture. And so we have on earth, we have those who are righteous, we have those who are wicked. Now, I did bring up Enoch last time because Enoch's name pops up in there, and I just simply brought him up because when we look, for example, at the book Patriarchs and Prophets, we find that Ellen White has quite a bit to say about Enoch and the evangelist that he was and the visions that he was given and the public speaking that he had done. Obviously, we don't pick that up from just the text. And so that gives us a little idea of what maybe went on in Enoch's life for the scriptures to say he walked with God. Well, obviously, even with Seth's line coming in, it still hasn't worked out to the point in which you and I now come to the story here of Noah, and we're finding that God has his eye on one person that he refers to as just and perfect or complete. So even with the Seth line, yes, we have Noah in that line. However, it appears that even the people of Seth really fell by the wayside. Yeah. And so I say if we have that as the background, probably the best biblical explanation and staying within the biblical confines. I mean, we're not pulling out angels and stuff like that now, but staying with that, we have the descendants of Canaan, we have the descendants of Seth, and eventually the descendants of Seth, just like ancient Israel, will eventually fall completely towards the wrong direction.
Yeah. I mean, we definitely see that. We've talked last time, I know, about these two lines of human beings, the faithful line embodied by Seth, right, and the unfaithful line embodied by Cain. Yeah. But here we have well, help me understand. Are we talking about angels here? Because I know to me, I think there's two main views here. One is that the sons of God refers to angels or some kind of, heavenly beings, fallen or unfallen, probably fallen. And the other view is that sons of God refers to human beings, right? That Seth's line, the good line, so to speak, started mingling and merging with Cain's line so we had this kind of unity in Adam and Eve, and then because of Cain and Abel, we have this split where we have the good line and the bad line, and then here in Genesis 6 we have them coming together again, and it's not good for the good line. So it's like they kind of gave up and just said, why are we separated from these, our cousins over there? We want to, have a closer relationship with them. Let's intermarry and stuff. So there's two views, that the sons of God are angels, and the other view is that they are human beings, and we're just talking about the merging of these two lines.
Go ahead. Dr. Dukan was very helpful on this in his commentary, in that he goes back to the earliest thoughts, and some of them were Jewish, that we got the angels involved, and that this involves a supernatural beings and such, that carried on. Let's face it, the Jews were also impacted by pagan ideology. I mean, it's where we get the idea of the separate soul and everything else. And so this carries on, and we've got some early church fathers who also carried on this idea. But we also have those Jewish writers and those early Christian fathers who did not buy into this, who understood that angels were not sexual beings in the sense that we think of sexual, and thus they did not go that line. So you've got two routes you can go. And for myself, I have no reason to bring in something here that the text is not talking about. All the text has been talking about so far has been humans who have been both righteous and unrighteous, and the tendency, just like Adam, the tendency of Adam to join Eve in the mistake that she was making. And here we would have the line of Seth also falling over towards the other one. And come on, Matthew, we see it all the way through the Old Testament. We just can't seem to get Israel to the promised land. Okay, we lose a whole generation of people out in the desert.
Sure. But here's the problem. Okay, so I hear what Dukan is saying here. I'm just going to play devil's advocate for a second, because here's a quote from 1 Enoch. It's in the Apocrypha. This is the 3rd century BC. This is a couple hundred years before Jesus, especially before you have a lot of Greek influence. There's obviously some at this time, but it's not like it was in the first few centuries AD, where it just was like an onslaught of Greek influence in the church and stuff. But there's plenty. But anyways, it says, and it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born to them beautiful and comely daughters, and the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And they were in all 200 who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon. Now, obviously, we're taking this verse way out of context. You might be like, what in the world is going on here? But the point is how similar this sounds to what's going on in Genesis 6. In fact, you will have copies of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which will say angels rather than sons of God. You'll find some that say sons of God and some copies that say angels, as if the Greek translators, or the Jews translated it, but the Greek-speaking Jews who translated the Old Testament into Greek, they use them interchangeably, it seems. So this, plus, you have the final difficulty that the Hebrew phrase sons of God is only, it seems, ever used of heavenly beings. Now, that's a little bit debatable. We know in Job 1:6, it says, one day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord. Well, angels in Hebrew is sons of God there. One day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. We've always understood that to be angels. Psalm 29:1, Psalm 82, they both say sons of God, or some version of that, and it's not clear whether they're referring to humans or heavenly beings. It could go either way, but probably heavenly beings in both of those passages. So you have the fact that this phrase is only ever used of angels, it seems, or some kind of heavenly being. The fact that the earliest interpreters here, even in 1 Enoch, several hundred years before Jesus, saw them as angels mingling or having sex with human people. You have Jude 6 and 7, which seems to imply something very similar. It talks about the angels who lost their dwelling in heaven. They were kept in darkness, and then it says, in a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality, as if Sodom and Gomorrah were in a similar way to how these evil angels behaved. So, you have Josephus, Philo, other apocryphal literature also talking about angels this way. On the one hand, okay. On the other hand, you have sons of God as a reference to Seth. We're talking about human beings here, and we do have human beings called God's sons or God's children. Augustine, another early church father, famously taught that this is not a reference to angels. This is a reference to human beings. So you have both traditions in Christian history, and the question is, which one is being referred to here? Which one is more accurate? The angel one is earlier, but I think that the whether this is talking about human beings is a fairly compelling explanation as well. It's hard to decisively decide between the two options. There you go. I just laid it out. Decide for yourselves. You have evidence both ways.
Here's what I'm going to throw in.
Okay.
And boy, I got to bring up that first Horseman in Revelation again as my example.
Okay.
There will be times that we come to the text and we would not have thought of something unless somebody planted that seed in our minds. Okay.
Yeah.
So if we're going along here, we have no reason up to this point to suddenly think that angels in heaven are suddenly involved with people. People have enough problems on their own to, let alone angels mess around. Okay?
But not angels in heaven, right. Evil angels. But yes.
Well, in the heavens, I should say. Okay.
Yes.
All right. But supernatural. And also, let me go back to something here. You mentioned 3rd century. We're talking back even younger than the days of Plato. And we see how Plato and the Greeks were influencing the Jewish writings back there around 300, 400 BC in terms of their ideas on the state of the dead.
Yeah.
And then, we're going to be talking about the flood here. We also have the flood stories that come out of various areas.
Yeah.
And you have to remember now, we have the Jewish people who have been in Babylon. They were in Babylon for that 70 years. They've got all that kind of stuff mixed in with some of their thinking. They're coming back, and they're at the crossroads of Babylon. They're at the crossroads of the Greeks. So, there's a lot of places for information to be settling into Jewish theology. And I just know from my studies of the state of the dead and the soul, that's one of them.
Yeah, you're not. Of course, you're not wrong there. The question is, well, I'll put it this way: there's plenty of Greek stories of the gods impregnating human beings. So it's not like this is unheard of. they're fairly prevalent stories. Zeus came, and it always causes trouble, by the way, right? It always causes trouble when the gods do that in these stories. This is how Hercules is born, or Heracles.
Hey, this was Eve's thinking. She thought she was impregnated with God back in her day.
Well, yeah. So it's that's the thing. It's in these pagan stories, but it's also in the birth story of Jesus. And so you have the pagan flood stories. They have their own explanation of where the flood came from, and then you have the real flood story here in the Bible. The true one, I should say, not the real one. And so you're going to find analogs in surrounding cultures. You're going to find analogs in surrounding cultures that seem to be very similar, and that's why it's really hard, because you can say, well, look, they clearly got these things from the Greeks or something. But you know what? We don't say the same thing about the flood stories. We don't say, well, they just got this whole thing from the Babylonians. It didn't really happen. No, of course it still happened. Just because the Babylonians had their own flood story doesn't mean this one isn't real. And just because the Greeks had their own stories of gods and humans procreating doesn't mean that it didn't happen here either. It's just, here's the kicker. We got to keep in mind the purpose of these first 8 verses is, number one, most importantly, to explain how the world got so wicked that God would have to destroy it with a flood. That's the main point here. And the second one is it offers a little explanation of where giants came from. Because, of course, the Israelites are later going to have to deal with giants. And it's kind of like, well, where did they come from? What is this all about? And so I think maybe it's helpful to focus on these two issues in that priority. That the first and foremost, the priority is to deal with how did human beings become so evil. We aren't given details. it would be great to know how exactly what human beings were doing. That was so bad, or you think to yourself, with an era of COVID and nonstop war and disease, could the world have been so much worse before the flood than it is now? That God would have to destroy it 6 chapters into the Bible? God's like, I got to destroy the world and start over? I mean, my goodness. Given everything that's happened in our human history, you think surely they couldn't have been worse than us. But apparently, in God's eyes, they were. So we aren't given the details. We're just told that they're worse than anything that's thus far happened. So I think we just got to take that on faith and just believe that God was telling the truth here, that they were indeed worse, and that this was the only way to save human beings before it got irreparably, destroyed by evil, I guess. That the flood is a redemptive thing. So anyways, I think the giants thing, that's what makes this so difficult, is because if it wasn't for the giants, you can see in verse 4 here what I'm talking about.
And I think something we have to keep in mind here is the relational aspect. Were they worse in terms of having armaments and all that kind of stuff, and nuclear bombs and whatnot? Yeah, probably not. Probably not. But we have these other factors that come in, the relational. We have murder already. We have multiple murders already going on before the time of the flood. We have what appears to be the abuse of women, in terms of them taking the women that they want and such like that. They see what they like, they take it. So it would appear that abuse of women and rape and such like that probably was part of the picture. We know that we've already moved quickly to the building of cities and whatever the cities would bring with them. Yeah. And so I know sometimes people are thinking, well, what all did they have back there? We don't know, but God was certainly interested, or most interested, in the relationship. And that's something we talked about last week, when nobody, poor Abel, he's not even called a brother until God comes along. So I do believe that the relationship aspect of this is, and he finds favor in the sight of with Noah there. Noah actually had a relationship with him like Enoch did.
Yeah, you're right. And this is the whole point. The whole point of telling this story about the sons of God and the daughters of man. I mean, this is a quality difference there. It's not the daughters of God and the sons of God. Right, and it's not just men and women. Please, people, don't get this misunderstood. It's not like there's one line of only men and one line of only women, and the men are all good and the women are all evil. It's not. It's a way of describing the two lineages, one which is generally more devout towards God and one which is not. But anyways, the whole point of all of that is to say that God found somebody in all of this mess that he could favor. In fact, favor is a key word in this text. Favor is, in Hebrew, is just Noah spelled backwards. So it's almost like the author is like making a little bit of a pun here, So, God found Noah. This is the whole point, that in this mess, we focus on God's destruction of the world, and obviously there's a lot to talk about there. But God's instinct is to save the world. God's instinct when he looks at the world is not to look for what's bad. There's plenty of bad there. That's not his goal. Like, what can I find that's wrong with this place? Like he's giving an inspection. What he's looking for is righteousness. He's going through this kind of trash pile and saying, what can I find in here that I can save? That's God's fundamental attitude towards human beings, toward his creation. It's not, let me find what's wrong so I can nitpick these people who never get it right. It's, let me look for something that I can save in here. Now, Dukan, going on the Sunday here, we can pop over and talk about that real quick, because we've been dealing with Sunday a little bit here. So he makes this point about the ark. I think I'm on Monday here. We're going to back up a day. He makes this point about the ark here, where he's saying this is the same Egyptian word that is used to talk about Moses being put in the basket and put on the Nile River. And he's drawn a parallel there. I'd never thought of that really before. And I thought that's really interesting, because the suggestion is someone's got to you got to risk Moses' life by putting him in this basket. You're trusting that God will preserve him in this basket. And you're doing this in order for your people to be saved. And so if there's a parallel to Noah, then it's, we're putting him in this, it's a very large basket. In this case, it's a boat. You're putting him in this boat, and with him is all the hopes of human civilization, of human beings, that they're going to survive.
Yep.
Right? And he can only survive because God is going to protect him in this vessel, just like God had to protect Moses in that vessel. So it's kind of like Noah's being cast downriver, saying God's going to have to keep him alive, and we trust that somehow God is going to work this out so that human beings are saved. Now, of course,
and not only did he bring out the similarities there with Moses in the basket, but I was also very intrigued because when we think of Ark, we also think of the Ark of the Covenant inside the sanctuary.
Yeah,
and he brought out that the formula for the dimensions of both Noah's Ark is reminiscent or follows the same way that the formula is created for creating the sanctuary's ark.
Are you saying it's like the same ratio?
Not the same ratio, but the formula for how the numbers are portrayed, how it lays it out. So it's the formula itself, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I mean, do we have sanctuary here? Sure, we've got sanctuary in the ark. We've got an altar that is built as soon as they come off the boat. So I mean, we continue to see aspects of sanctuary throughout this.
Yes, absolutely. Good. All right. Well, we've spent a good amount of time here. We're telling people don't get so caught up on the preparation of the flood. Now, you see here, Dukan barely touches on I don't know if he touches on the giants here at all, or the sons of God. I'm looking at it here. He kind of mentions, no, not really. Just that God was sorry that he had created human beings, or he regretted it, which is a very fruitful thing to discuss, right? Dukan says here on Saturday, what God sees now instead of Tov, which is good, is Ra, which is evil.
Mm-hmm.
And it is as if God regretted that he created the world, which is now full of Ra. Like God's goal in creating the world, again, this just affirms God's good intentions towards the world. He didn't create a world to be broken. He didn't create a world he didn't care about. He created the world designed to be good. And because of our fall, we've polluted that world. And God is like, what do I do now? And this might be a helpful thing as a teacher. Ask your class, what would you do in God's shoes? You have all this power and creativity and goodness, but you can't force people to make decisions that you want them to make. What do you do? How, you gave them a perfect environment and they ruined it. What do you do now? How do you solve this problem? It's easy to kind of come down and say, well, a flood seems kind of extreme. But honestly, if you're God, what do you do when you're just daily watching, one presumes, murder and rape and stealing and abuse and these, like, what do you do? Do you just watch that on and on and on forever, seeing human beings get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse? And there's only one family that's righteous, it seems, that's left. And you wait until it swallows them up too, and now everybody's bad? What do you do if you're God? I'm not saying there's easy answers to that question. I'm just saying, try to have some empathy for God's position here. What do you do?
And really, we can't even say one family because we only know what he says about Noah.
Yeah, but, I think that the assumption in Genesis is that the patriarch, the male head of the family, represents the immediate family, at least, right? Like when you get this even in the New Testament, right? When the head of the household, the pater familias, is converted, the whole household comes with him. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the idea is Abraham is righteous. Was everybody in Abraham's family is righteous? Probably not. But when
I agree with you.
Yeah, but when the head honcho comes in, everybody comes in.
Right.
How it worked.
Right.
So, okay, we're going to go on to Monday, the event of the flood. And so now we are in chapter 7 of Genesis. All right, I'm going to move my Bible over here. Why don't you go ahead and get us started on Monday here?
Okay, Monday is going to be my mic drop day, okay?
Oh, so I'm prepared. Revelation.
I am preparing you for it. Well, so Monday, the flood event. Let's go back to those words that you were just reading where God saw it was good. God saw was not good. All right.
Yeah.
So already we're seeing language that points back to creation. And
Okay.
obviously what's going to come out of the flood is a recreation. But we actually have the language that goes back to creation that's making that connection for us. And so there was a couple of statements that, like in the Sabbath School lesson, this was interesting. It said, this is a paradoxical message in that God has to destroy to allow for a new. Now, if we think about that,
Yes.
we find this throughout the Bible. I mean,
Yes.
when you go to Christ, he must die in order that we may live. In Romans 6, for example, we have to die, self must die, be buried and gone in order for us to have a completely new life, a completely radical transformation in Christ. So this message, we find it early on in Scripture, but we find that this is a truth throughout the Scriptures.
Yes. Man, that is good stuff there. And it's,
that was not my mic drop either.
Well, haven't you gotten to it yet?
Oh, no. It's going to get good.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And but the destruction side of the thing is kind of like the dark side of the moon here. It's something we're not quick to associate the dark stuff with God. And again, it's worth reminding folks that in the fall, the wages of sin was death. God didn't create death, but God, by excluding Adam and Eve from the tree of life, basically guaranteed death. All right, it wasn't the touching of the fruit or the eating of the fruit that brought instant death. What brought death ultimately was God excluding them from the tree of life. All right, so yes. I don't want to say that God is responsible for death or that death is a good thing. Death is not a good thing, but it was a necessary thing in order for human beings to eventually be saved. In other words, God cannot allow us to live forever as sinners. That's the very thing he is trying to avoid. And when it comes to the two options, I can live forever with sin or I could die, God's saying, trust me, death is better for you. Because ultimately, I can resurrect those who are in me. It's not a big deal in the end. So, God allows this death. He not just allows it, but kind of actively creates a situation where death is the only outcome. And so that's kind of part of God's dark side, if you will. And God here is this idea of destruction is not an isolated thing. What you're saying, Jim, is that this destruction is part of this process of creation or recreation, as it were. It's part of the plan. And so you can't just look at this in isolation. It's like, well, God sent a flood. But God sent a flood in order to do what? Save human beings. All right.
Now, backing up just a few lines there on the lesson,
yep.
You'll notice that the author Dukan, or the Sabbath School lesson, brought out that there is a reversing, or there's going to be a reversing of creation through this whole flood event.
Okay.
So let's pull out the good stuff now. Okay.
Hit me with it.
All right. So I already mentioned that our opening text is Jesus in Matthew 24, who has taken the days of Noah and applying it to the end time. Okay. We should not be surprised then when Christ himself, in giving the revelation of himself, also discusses the undoing of creation, so there is a new creation or a new earth. And as I know you know, when we come to Revelation, we see the end time undoing of creation in the 7 trumpets and 7 plagues, which, going back to our chiasm, the 7 trumpets and the 7 plagues are parallel, mirrored to each other in the book.
Yeah.
They are, step by step, the undoing of creation. And so we have not only this reversal of creation, which we'll talk about more here in Genesis, where as things come back into place, we see creation being redone, if you will. But there's another another reversal that I just think is absolutely fantastic. And it comes just before the 7 trumpet undoing of creation.
Okay.
And that is what's happening in the 4 horsemen. And I've said before, but all roads lead to the 4 horsemen, because the 4 horsemen are the final messages and the final sifting of the church.
Okay.
And so when we look at the 4 horsemen, we have victory in the gospel going on that first seal. We just looked at the language in the 2nd seal and the 5th seal the other day, when we realized that the word there was really to slay. It was a sanctuary term. And when you come to the 3rd seal, you still have allusion to the sanctuary, with the Day of Atonement nearing through the whole process of the crops. But when you come to the 4th seal, here's my mic drop now. When you come to the 4th seal, we have a complete reversal of everything that has gone before. No longer do you have a sacrificial knife in the 2nd seal. Now you have a sword of destruction. It's the same sword that Christ has in Revelation 19. Okay. No longer do you have a sacrificial term like you do in the 2nd seal. Now you have the word to simply kill and destroy. Yeah. No longer do you have the warning about the crops in the 3rd seal. Now you have the destruction of crops in the 4th seal. And here's something, Matthew, that I think is just really cool. Each of those 4 horsemen are introduced by the 4 living creatures that we read about in the previous chapter, Revelation 4. Yeah. Well, the last one that John mentions is the eagle. Okay? So here you have the eagle, which is around the throne, but you have the eagle who introduces this 4th and final message, the 4th horseman. But if we simply open our concordance, we will find that this word for eagle is atos, and it is the same Greek word that Jesus uses. And here it goes now, Matthew 24, our text for this week, okay, where he tells us that at the end, it is the atos, it is the vultures who are gathering around where all the dead carcasses are. In other words, everything in the 4th horseman has now been reversed. Opportunity is now closed. Probation is now closed. The church has been sifted. You have 2 camps of people: those who are truly Christ, whose blood cry from under the altar, just like Abel in the 5th seal; the wicked who are stepping back from the presence of the wrath of the Lamb in the next seal. And then we go on to the 7 trumpets, where creation is now undone, so that we can have a new earth. Everything is about reversal to get to what God intended from the very beginning with the garden.
All right. Okay. There, I threw up an appropriate meme for what just happened. So you connected all these dots. Oh, man. Okay. Whew. Well, the good news is this is videos. People can just back that up if they want to see that again. But that is, boy, man, you're dropping. Whew. All right.
I had to get that, 2-minute sermon in there.
Yeah, man, but you nailed it. You made those 2 minutes count. Goodness gracious. If you want to get baptized, just go ahead and leave something in the comments. Well, okay. Anyways, there's a lot here then, what you're saying. I love it. I love it. Your first point here, of course, before this one, is this idea of this creative destruction. This creative destruction going on. And then you're also tying it here to the 4 horsemen.
You're in the recording.
Incredible. All right. Is that me echoing? Huh. Go figure. Okay. Wow. And I love it. Your point. Your first point is leading us to the bottom of the page, or what in us needs to be destroyed in order to be created anew. And this is something that we time and time again in the Bible. I'll pick up on this one. I'm not the expert in the 4 horsemen. I'll pick up on this one because, you see, oftentimes you can't learn something until you unlearn something. This is true of the religious leaders in Jesus' day. I mean, the barrier to them understanding him and his mission is all of the preconceived ideas that they had in their head. There's some things you need to unlearn before you can learn them. Now, this is true in an abstract. We can never, though, take the flood away from it being a historical, violent, destructive event in which people lost their lives. Okay, so we can kind of spiritualize and talk about these principles here, and that's fine. But we at the end of the day, that's what it was. I don't think they were philosophizing about it too much while the waters were rising. But it reminds me of The Record Keeper, that series that came out, I don't know, 10 or so years ago. It was a little controversial. And they dealt with the flood in one of their episodes. I'm sure you can still find it on YouTube. And I remember one of the angels goes down to earth during the flood, and it's on a rock, I guess, before it gets covered. And just kind of like, I don't know. I just remember that look. She looks up at the camera above her as if she's looking up into heaven. Like, why? Like that even some of the angels may not have understood. I don't know. I mean, obviously that's speculation. It's just creative license, I guess. But it reflects the fact that no matter how much faith you have, no matter how much you believe in the justice of what God did, it's still a painful thing. It's not something one rejoices over, or one should just kind of talk about breezily. Like, oh yeah, I killed all those people, but they had it coming because they were evil. Even if they were evil, they're fellow human beings. And that's what separates the people of Seth from the people of Cain, I think, is that Cain can kill callously and not care what happens to his brother. But the people of God will always care what happens to their brother, even if their brother is evil. Even if their brother is wicked, even if their brother is receiving, just punishment for whatever it is that they may have done wrong, you still care about them. It's still a human affair. It's still part of the family. And so, if I was teaching this lesson, I'd be careful about people who make comments that are just too easily dismissive, that lack empathy, that lack any kind of sympathy whatsoever. You should always have sympathy, because we're talking about a huge loss of human life here. And I was watching this. I don't want to get too far afield here, but I was watching this think tanker from the UK talking about the war in Ukraine, and he was talking about all the Russian jets and stuff that got shot down. And he's like, those of us who are on Ukraine's side in this, we rejoice in a sense when we see the Russian army being thwarted and their equipment being destroyed. And he's like, but even still, when an APC gets destroyed or a jet gets downed, we're still talking about human lives, even if they're the enemy. In this case, they're still human beings, and you may be happy that that's one less device blowing up a city. It's one less person shooting a gun at innocent people, but they're still human beings. And so you got to kind of carry both of those emotions at the same time, I think.
And here's something too, and I think you have a slide I sent you from the Creation Museum or the Ark Experience that was talking about the numbers in terms of potential population. Okay. Quite honestly, I grew up with this idea that everything goes very quickly from Adam and Eve to Cain and Abel to the flood story. And so I know as a young person, I just had this vision of you got a couple little communities down in a valley someplace, and that's about the total population. Yeah. And then I look at something like this and I think, wow, I mean, there may have been far, far more humans on this earth than I had ever imagined.
Yeah.
But here's another thing. Somewhere in our notes I was reading where Noah was the first one in the line of Seth born after Adam died. This means that Adam saw throughout his lifetime, and I don't remember how many years that was, but what we're talking, almost 1,000 years?
Yeah.
Adam had seen almost to the time of Noah the results of what sin had done.
Yeah.
So we think of just Cain and Abel and the loss there, but for Adam to actually live through generation after generation after generation, I mean, if people were having kids every 20, 30 years, you can just see how quickly the earth would have populated underneath Adam and Eve there. He sees this. I cannot imagine the heartbreak that he saw in this all the way down through the line.
Yeah.
And I think Enoch is still alive, so it's very possible that Adam and Eve through Enoch might have even begun to hear the preaching of a soon prophecy, and already seeing how the Lord was going to step in. I mean, there's so much here that we really have not thought about.
Yeah.
But anyways, that just kind of boggles my mind. And also, I think that goes back a little bit to our subject of giants. Let's remember from the scriptures, it seems clear that the people were created much taller than they were following the flood event. All right. And I know that there's discussion there about the fact that maybe diet, had changed that.
Yeah.
But here's Moses in his day. To Moses, these people might have been 2 or 3 times taller.
Sure.
So when you think of the intensity and the magnification of sin in the world at that time, combined with people whose minds have been active in sin for hundreds of years, I mean, yeah, it could be far, far worse than we really generally think of.
Yes. And just as a reminder to the viewers, you brought up Enoch and Noah. You have, in those two people, you have 2 different kinds of people. They have the people God saves from something, and the people God saves through something. And either way, you're saved, right? I'd like to be Enoch. You wonder if Noah's on the boat after like 3 months, and he's like, it would have been nice to be translated. That would have been easier. Oh man. But you don't know. So sometimes we got to be saved through something. Sometimes we got to get through the mess, and that's how God saves us, through things. In fact, that seems to be the way that God does it the most, and so, or at least most frequently, I should say. Okay, we are going to be moving through here on. We got some tracks to make. We've only got to Monday. We're going to switch over to Tuesday here and talk about the end of the flood. Wow, it's over by Tuesday. That was a really quick flood. And of course, it's back in Genesis chapter 7, the end of 7 and 8. All right. So we're gonna go. Let's see here to Genesis chapter 7. It's talking about this is kind of the uncreating of the world and how all of this is going. So we're gonna head over here to our Bible. We see here, whoopsie, I'm making the Bible smaller. That's not what I want to do. And we're going to lock that down. Okay, so we see here towards the end of 7, we're on Tuesday now. It says the waters flooded the earth for 150 days. I like how that is. It the New King James over there? It says the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. That is a lot of water all over everything. Do you think Noah went out for a swim, Jim? Once the rain stopped, he's just like, might as well make the most of it here, get some exercise.
As I've said before, we keep this as non-traditional as possible.
Non-traditional is your nice way of saying I'm a heretic. I appreciate that. All right. So obviously in verse 23, when it says that he destroyed all living things, we're accepting Noah. We're talking about the things on the earth. And of course that brings up another question. I don't want to get bogged down on these side questions, but what did the animals do? Couldn't you have moved the animals up top of a mountain and just taken care of the humans? But again, as I think you were alluding to earlier, Jim, the goal here is really recreation. He's kind of starting over. He's reshaping the face of the earth and starting over. If he just wanted to kill wicked humans, I mean, you can do that with a disease. You can do that with fire coming down from heaven. If you're God, you can just snap your fingers, like Thanos or something, and they just drop dead, right? Why the flood? Why destroying a plant and animal life? Because it seems that he's returning the earth to that without form and void stage, with the exception of Noah and his family, and he's going to recreate in a different way this time, and start over. But we're at long last. We're going to switch over here to chapter 8, because that's where we're at on the beginning of Tuesday here, and we're going to say, what does it mean that God remembered Noah? There it is in verse 1. God remembered Noah. Not just Noah, by the way, and all the wild animals and livestock that were with him in the ark, and he starts receding the waters. What does that mean that God remembered Noah?
Got a good memory.
Did God forget Noah at some point? Like, where did that guy go?
That was a big bathtub, you know. But yeah,
Like
you
looking
know,
for the soap?
I mean, we find this at the center of the chiasm. I mean, it suggests something more than just, hey, you know what? I remember you were out there in a boat. Didn't forget about you. Man,
Yeah.
he does have a whole lot of other planets to be focused on too, right?
Yeah.
But there seems to be something richer, something deeper here. Before he went into the ark, there was already God sharing with him that he wants to establish a covenant with him. He wants a covenant relationship with him. Now he is remembering him. And at the end, we're going to be coming back to that covenant again. So to me, this term is suggestive of far more than just, oh, yeah, you know, I didn't write it down, but I didn't forget you.
Yeah, absolutely. But to say that this is the center of the entire story, it really puts a lot of weight on this one verse in Genesis 8:1. God remembered Noah and every living thing. All right, we can't forget the animals here. It's like God has remembered his creation. And again, guys, when he says remember, it doesn't imply that he forgot. What it means is he's just kind of, you know, how best to put it, that it's now kind of like coming to mind, I guess. Now it's time to do something. Maybe it's like the time is at hand to do something about this person, and he's stuck in this boat still.
Let me throw in the book of Joel, for example.
Okay.
In the book of Joel, everything is going downhill for disobedient Israel. Uh-huh. And at the center of the chiasm of Joel is where you see repentance.
Yeah.
And once there's repentance, then the second half of the Joel goes to all the blessings. And it's just like Job, you know, the people are more blessed than they were beforehand.
Yes.
And I see this here. This is a covenant relationship. He's making this covenant. And how about the other side? Why wouldn't God remember him when he remembered God in all the wickedness of his day?
Yeah.
You know, and so I really see the relationship here. I haven't forgotten you. I haven't forgotten the promises. I haven't forgotten that through you, you know, the messianic promise is going to be fulfilled. So I think it's just pregnant with a lot more meaning than just memory.
Yes. Yeah, I think so too. It seems to me a term of endearment of sorts, that they're intimate, that they're acquainted. You know, you don't typically remember things that are forgettable or that are unimportant to you. So, you know, it just seems to be, it's kind of like, you know, I say, I don't know, I'm going to go off, Jim, to go get a job overseas. And when I make a lot of money, I'm going to come back and I'm going to share it with you. You know, and so I go off and I make a lot of money. And then it's like, and Matthew remembered his promise to Jim and heads back. It's not that I forgot it all those years. It's just like, now is the time when I've made enough and it's time to come back and share it with Jim. And so it's kind of like, it's just kind of indicating in the chronology of the life that now is the time when the next thing needs to happen. And so, you know, God remembering his promise is, well, Dukan says here, it says in the biblical context, he says this on over there. Let me get rid of the Bible, and we'll put Sabbath School lesson here again. This was on Tuesday. Let's see here. There we go. It says in the biblical context, the God who remembers means the fulfillment of his promise and often refers to salvation. Right? So in this context, of course, it means that he's going to stop the waters of the flood and begin to undo that and work on. So we've reached that kind of crescendo in the narrative. Right? This is why this is the center. The flood built up, and at this point, from henceforward, the flood waters are going to go down, and God is going to undo everything that's been done thus far, and move on. Now, what's interesting is that even though God is doing this in a supernatural way, Noah still has to kind of figure out whether the land has appeared or not. That's you know, sometimes right. God just does. You know, I don't mean this as a criticism, of course, But God just does the minimum sometimes. Like, I'm going to bring the water down. It's up for you to figure out where the land is and how to get out of the boat. It's like, you go ahead and send out those birds, buddy. And you figure, it'd be nice if God's just like, hey, man, in 30 days, you'll hit dry land. Great. Thanks so much. Appreciate that. I was like, yeah, you figure it out. Send out the birds. Do some science here. And,
I think of Jonah coming out of the well, and he's on the shore. Okay, Jonah, you figure it out. I got you back on the right track.
Right.
You find a map. You find the right road. You make your way.
Yes.
So, yeah, God doesn't do everything here.
No, he doesn't do everything. He does tell Noah when to get out of the ark, though, down in verse 15 and 16 of Genesis. And he says, he just says, get out of the ark. Take everybody with you, which, like, duh, it's like, you are annoying the entire time you're staying in the ark. It's like, no, of course he could take everyone with him. I wish he would have left the spiders in the ark, you know what I mean? But
right.
Took everyone out, and they began this process of, like, Adam. Noah is kind of a Adam 1.5 here. We don't want to say he's a second Adam, but he's kind of starting over. It's just different, and it's harder now because of the fall. So Noah, what's he do? The first thing he does when he gets out of the ark is he offers a sacrifice to God, and hopefully it wasn't the last two of some kind of animal, but and that's why we don't have that animal anymore. And God, as God said in His heart, here in verse 21, we'll just go ahead and put that back up. That God says in His heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, even though human beings are not changed, even though we still got to deal with sin. I'm not going to curse the ground again, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. And you can talk about this forever. What does this mean? Does this mean God, that the flood was a mistake? That because obviously it wasn't effective in the long run. It's not, what are you going to do? Send the flood every 1,000 years to kind of, we're going to call this the Great Reset, and to just reset human beings again. The flood isn't going to affect the heart, but God decides, it happened now. Maybe the flood just isn't necessary again, because maybe He knew that human beings would not get so evil before He returns. I don't know, but God says, I'm not going to do that again. And because of Noah's sacrifice, it seems.
I was gonna say here in this chapter, we actually have a couple of things that point to the sanctuary. Not only do we have the altar, not only do we have the sacrifice. Here in verse 4, the ark rested in the 7th month on the 17th day. I like the fact that Dukan reminds us that this coincides with the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. This is a time of rejoicing. So we're finding a number of pieces here that fit with the sanctuary. Okay. One of which was already shared, the formula for the size of the ark being a similar formula for creating the Ark of the Covenant. So we're finding a number of pieces here that keep on making connections.
Yes. It's great. That's great. I love it. All right, let's talk about the covenant. Let's make some tracks here. I think we can head on over to Wednesday and Thursday. They're kind of part 1 and part 2. The new covenant, the new covenant. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit there. The covenant, part 1, and there's the covenant, part 2. All right. So God establishes a covenant with Noah. This is what He makes before the flood comes, right? He's like, I'm going to protect you guys. And this was a promise of preservation during what's about to happen. Then we go over to chapter 8 again, and in verse 20, and this is where God, again, in the context of this worship scene, says, I'm never going to curse, I'm never going to do this again. What kind of covenant is this? Is this a covenant binding? We usually think of Moses' covenant, and we usually don't talk about other covenants in the Old Testament.
Well, you did mention New Covenant. You said maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves here with that language. But when we think about it, every covenant that God is making with these individuals is a new covenant. They're all building on the original covenant with Adam. And so we have a covenant here with Noah as we have this recreation and life beginning again. As you say, we have the Mosaic covenant with Israel. Then we have the covenant with Abraham. So, I mean, and then we have the covenant with David. So throughout the line, I guess the covenants and how they come in is just about as interesting as how God maintains the line of individuals, a line that you would not necessarily expect, but a line of individuals that keeps that messianic promise alive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you always see a little bit of foreshadowing everywhere you look. That it's pointing towards something bigger than merely the events that we're reading about. We have here this we kind of glanced by this here in let's see if I can pull this back up, where it says that Noah built an altar to the Lord, took of every clean animal and every clean bird. What is a clean animal and a clean bird? Because we haven't had Moses' law yet. So it seems to me that this distinction between clean and unclean, of course, it's there when the animals go into the ark, right? We have a certain number of clean and a certain number of unclean animals based entirely on that status of clean or unclean. These are things that we don't know anything about. Again, if you're reading Genesis for the first time, you're like, what the heck is a clean animal? Does it mean he bathed it? Right? You would have no idea because you haven't gotten to Leviticus yet, where these distinctions are made very clear. So, of course, there's two ways to look at this. You can look at this and say, clearly these distinctions between clean and unclean existed before Moses' law, therefore they're still binding, which tends to be how Adventists have looked at this in terms of eating clean and unclean foods. We say, yes, it's in the law of Moses, but it also existed before the law of Moses, just like the Sabbath did, which means that even if Moses' law contains these things, they didn't originate there. They're not only there. They existed before. A law saying don't murder is not an American law. You're going to find that law just about on every country on earth, probably every country on earth. It doesn't mean it belongs to America. It doesn't mean it belongs to some country that came before us. And it's like, oh, you're adopting this British law. It's like, well, actually, I mean, this is a fairly timeless law that has existed everywhere. So it doesn't belong to one country. It doesn't belong to one covenant, we would say in this case. Of course, the other way to look at it, I would say it's more predominant in academia and stuff, is that, well, of course, the author of Genesis, who's aware of Moses' law, is reading it back into Genesis. He's acting like this is how it's always been. And that's what critics will say about the Sabbath, too. Sabbath didn't start at creation. It started at Moses, and they just placed it back at creation when they wrote the story. But, of course, we're not going to go down that road. That means that others are, if you're going to take the Bible as it reads, you're going to have to deal with the fact that these clean and unclean distinctions are present earlier.
So here's a couple thoughts, and that is, this actually goes back to our earlier study with Cain and Abel, because when we're looking at verse 20 here, and it says he offered a burnt offering.
Yeah.
Where did this come from? Who said that he had to offer something that was burnt?
Yeah. No, that's true. That's true. But okay. I mean, one could infer that because God created the animal skins for them, that's where they would learn it from, right? And
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. My point is, when we look back at Cain and Abel, and we're wondering, well, it doesn't tell us why Abel's sacrifice was accepted and why Cain's was not. Yeah. Now we come to the next story and we find out, hey, guess what? There's no mention of any fruits or vegetables on this altar. There's only mention of specific beasts, clean beasts, and they're offered as burnt offerings. Yeah. So as we're going along, we're actually picking up more information that lends itself towards everybody had to know earlier what was expected.
Yes. Yeah, everybody had to know earlier what was expected. Absolutely. So, this is not a major part of the lesson, but it might be something you want to pick up on in class for a second. It also talks about the rainbow, which is obviously a gay pride symbol in the Bible.
Erase.
Like, how do you go back on this video thing? Anyways, there's there's no need to go there in class. Okay, don't
But you know what? You know what? I do appreciate you mentioning this because
Really?
I had a friend. I had a friend a number of years ago who something came up about a rainbow, and they were going to get it for their office decal or something like that.
Yeah.
And they said, "No, we're going to leave that alone. It's the wrong thing." I think we have to just live our lives normally. We know what the rainbow is for. We know what it means.
Right.
And, we come to Revelation. We talk about the rainbow above God's throne.
Yeah.
The rainbow is a sign of promise. And you know what? This is an opportunity. And here, I'll just throw this in. I won't even charge you for this one, okay? This is just a free moment here. But when I was in the military, when I was in basic training, the one thing that we were allowed to have over there at Fort Lost in the Woods, Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, the one thing that we were allowed to have was religious material while we were in basic training. Mm-hmm. So I could have my Bible and I could have my Sabbath School lesson studies. Okay. And it was really kind of cool because the other guys had nothing to read. And so we would sit in a circle in our room, about 7 or 8 of us in the evening, and we would pass the Sabbath School, and I don't remember what the topic was, but we would pass the Sabbath School lesson around, and each guy would read one day's, and we would talk about it as we were sitting there spit shining our boots and our brass and all that kind of stuff. And then one day we were out on the firing range, and it was raining. We're in our ponchos. It's a mess. But when the rain stopped and we're all sitting out there, we had a rainbow. And one of the guys sitting next to me said, "Hey, isn't there something in the Bible about a rainbow?" And it gave me an opportunity. I mean, to me, it was like, I went through Christian school all my life, and it's like, wow. But it gave me an opportunity to share the truth.
Yes.
So to my friends, I would say, sure, things change, culture changes things. There are certain symbols, there are certain words that are different today. I try to be respectful of those things. I try not to abuse those things or make more light of them. But let's not be afraid of what is truth. And let's not be afraid of using that opportunity to share what is truth. Because I'll tell you what, these other things, where's the hope in them? There is hope in the scriptures. There's hope in these stories that we have. And so if I have an opportunity to share that hope of Christ with others, I'm going to take advantage of it.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a wonderfully positive way of looking at it. It means what it means here in the Bible. We shouldn't be afraid of it, shouldn't shy away from it. I would say, the flip side of that coin to me is there's also no need to be a jerk about other uses of the rainbow. I know we went to the Creation Museum. I know somebody showed, they had like a mug there or something. It was like, let's take back the rainbow. It's just kind of this like belligerent thing. You're not going to take it back.
Right. They never took it from you in the first place. By trashing, how other people use it. So you're just going to be a jerk. So just use it in this meaningful way. It's a reminder of God's promise that he's never going to destroy the earth again through a flood. It's his commitment to the preservation of life, as Dukan puts it. It's an act of grace. It's a sign of grace. As you say, it's in Revelation chapter 4, over the throne of God. It's called an emerald rainbow there. And so it's a symbol of kind of his very presence. Like you see in Revelation 4 there, that like this rainbow, which symbolizes that commitment to human life, is bending over his very throne. It's in his presence, presumably constantly, as a reminder of his promise right here, of this covenant right here. And that's incredible to see. It's like, I don't know, you find some famous person or some rich person, you go through their office and you're like, yeah, here's a little knickknack that somebody handed me when I was young, and I've kept it as a good reminder of where I've come from or something. I kept my dad's hard hat to remind myself of those origins. But in this case, God's keeping this emblem of his promise all the way in the Revelation, saying, I remember what I promised Noah, and I've kept that promise. And you think that's a really beautiful thing. The God doesn't need to have a knickknack or a symbol in his presence to remind him. What the purpose of the rainbow in that scene is so that we see it and we think, wow, that's still important to him. That's so important. It's in his presence.
It's like, wow, he really cares about us. He really does.
And when I see that rainbow in Revelation, and I'm reminded of his covenant with me, I don't have to fear what comes in Revelation in terms of the undoing of creation. I don't have to fear about the 7 last plagues.
Yes.
I know that he is my ark, and I'm okay because I trust in his promises.
There you go. All right, guys, we're going to leave it there for this week. Hope you enjoyed this discussion. I've learned a lot just going through this. I enjoyed the mic drops. And just, man, it was really faith affirming. I know there's so much more that could be said about the flood. I mean, you're talking about 3 chapters in the Bible, 3 hugely consequential, important chapters. But I think we've hit these highlights. I think you've given you enough food for thought. Don't want to keep you here all day. And anyways, thanks for watching. We will be back next week with another episode of Sabbath School Boot Camp.